I guess so. Tiwari ji is very good at taking a group photograph through this meet. So if everybody's camera is switched on, so all the participants, guests, as well as the speaker comes together. Acha. Okay, Dr. Nurmalya, that will be fine as well if it is not switching on. So
recording is on. So
सभी को प्रणाम सर, मुंगेर यूनिवर्सिटी.
Sir, namaste, welcome sir.
मुंगेर यूनिवर्सिटी डीन ऑफ ह्यूमैनिटीज.
Namaskar,
Welcome
Ajit.
sir. Welcome sir.
अजीत कुमार ठाकुर.
Welcome sir.
So Tiwari ji, may I have?
Yes, we can start.
Okay.
We can start.
So on behalf of the School of Philosophy and Culture at Shri Mata Vaishno Devi University, as well as thanking the Indian Council of Philosophical Research, which has given us the opportunity to hold this study circle meetings. And this is the fifth meeting in that line. Where I guess so the last speaker was Dr. Nirmalya Guha, who is already present with us. And today we have with us Dr. Nilanjan Das, who is a lecturer in philosophy at the Department of Philosophy in the University College London, UK. And his presentation topic, which seems for me very interesting, is Vashubandhu on the first person. So, but before I hand over the issues as well as the charges to Dr. Anil Kumar Tiwari, who is the former head of the School of Philosophy and Culture at Shri Mata Vaishno Devi University, I will formally like to thank as well as also welcome all the participants and speakers over here. Especially we have with us our teacher, our guru, as well as our, I will say, the beacon, Professor Vijay Barua, who has recently joined IIT Jammu and was before in IIT Ropar, and before that in IIT Delhi, and before that when we were students at IIT Kanpur. Similarly, we have our friend with us, Dr. Hari Narayanan, and he was a colleague in the School of Philosophy at Shri Mata Vaishno Devi University before he went on to join the Department of Philosophy, or I guess the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Jodhpur. And we are also fortunate to have Dr. Virendra Bangu, who is the head or the regional director of the Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts, with whom we have a memorandum of understanding, and we hold the regional, I will say, center at Shri Mata Vaishno Devi University. So welcome, sir. We also have Dr. Isha Malhotra, who is a colleague, friend, and the head of the School of Languages and Literature. Along with that, I can see that many others have also joined, especially Dr. Guha, who was our last speaker. Then we also have Simran Rana, who was our student, my faculty colleagues, Dr. Anil Kumar Tiwari, as well as Dr. Madhu Mangal Chaturvedi. We also have a few more guests and I guess so participants in the list whom I cannot see because it's not coming down. And we also have Dr. Ajit Kumar Thakur, who is joining us from Munger. So I welcome all of you to this meet, and I'm pretty hopeful that this is going to be a very, very fruitful discourse. And I hand over the charge to Dr. Anil Kumar Tiwari, who will be moderating this session for today. Dr. Tiwari.
Thank you, Samantha. On the behalf of the university and Indian Council of Philosophical Research and the School of Philosophy and Culture, I extend warm welcome to all of you. Let me briefly introduce today's speaker, Dr. Nilanjan Das, who is a lecturer in the Department of Philosophy in the University College London, UK. As far as I know from his background, which I gathered from his own website and also the website of the Department of Philosophy, his research interest lies largely in the area of epistemological thinking, that too especially in Indian philosophy. Dr. Nilanjan Das graduated and obtained his master's degree from the University of Jadavpur with the specialization in mathematical logic. And after that, he moved to MIT for his PhD. And in MIT, he wrote his dissertation for the degree of PhD on epistemic stability. And he received presidential fellowship and also Rhodes Scholarship, which he declined to avail presidential fellowship. He has illustrious career ahead. He is very young, and to my knowledge, given his age, he is going to be one of the wonderful philosophers. He is already a wonderful philosopher in all young colleagues. He has illustrious publication record to his credit. He published quite frequently in the Journal of Indian Philosophy, Philosophy and Phenomenological Research, News, Ratio, the Review of Symbolic Logic, and recently he is going to have his appearance in the British Journal for the History of Philosophy. More wonderfully, I must say, he is one of the associate editors of the journal called Mind. And to my knowledge, Mind is the first journal in English, which was named earlier a quarterly review of psychology and philosophy, and now it is named a quarterly review of philosophy from 1892. So it's a very old journal, and this is a very prestigious assignment which he is holding for the journal. He is going to speak today on the title Vasubandhu on the first person. And only yesterday I just browsed the Journal of Mind, and there I noticed one wonderful conversation between Ellen Montfort of 2006. In fact, the conversation took place in London School of Economics between Ellen Montfort and Robert Rowland Smith. Robert asked Ellen that who is Ellen Montfort? And Ellen Montfort responded, I suppose I am. And this story reminded me of another wonderful event in Indian subcontinent which took place between Nagasena, a Buddhist monk in 2nd century BCE, and the Greek king Menander. The Bactrian king Menander asked Nagasena, what is your name? Nagasena replied that people call me Nagasena. If we compare these two responses, one by Ellen in 21st century in 2006, and the 2nd century before Common Era, Nagasena's response, a lot more philosophical questions can be raised with respect to these two responses. So I'm glad to welcome Dr. Nilanjan Das, and I'm quite curious to hear his ideas on Vasubandhu on the first person. So let us welcome Dr. Das and hear him. And for the sake of order, we will keep on noting the questions from the chat box. So if you like ask question, you can ask in the chat box, or in the end of the lecture, you can ask your questions directly by turning on your mic. So that would be the order, and I expect that Dr. Das will take some 45 to 50 minutes for his presentation, and then we will move on to question hour session. So over to Dr. Nilanjan Das. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be talking to you. This is not an opportunity that I have very often, given that I live in the UK and I have not been able to travel to India for the last couple of years, like 2 years at least. So I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you about philosophy. So I'm going to share in the chat a handout with you, which you will be able to download and read along as I'm speaking, because I will be speaking on the basis of the handout. So the topic for us today is Vasubandhu on the first person. So the debate we are going to talk about is the debate about the nature and the existence of the self. So what do we mean by the self in this context? So the self in the context of like what some people call classical Indian philosophy, what I call Sanskrit philosophy, it's basically either understood as a person, Purusha, or as a constituent of a person, some part of a Purusha, which we pick out by means of the first person pronoun I, and which serves as the subject of mental states, the bearer of mental states, and the agent who performs actions, and which persists through time. So it basically has these three characteristics. So it is the referent of the first person pronoun I, it serves as the subject of mental states and the agent of actions, and it persists through time. So in the history of Sanskrit philosophy, the Buddhists claim that there is no fundamentally or substantially existent self, while the Brahminical philosophers, the people who subscribed to the authority of the Veda, they rejected this claim. Now, so this is all familiar, should be familiar to you, given that you study Indian philosophy in your college and your universities. But the question that I shall be exploring, I think, is a less explored question. The question is, if there is no fundamentally existent self, does the first person pronoun refer to anything at all? So this actually has been a topic of discussion amongst Anglophone philosophers since the early 20th century. But just to give you a sense of why this question matters philosophically, it might be worth sort of thinking about self-ascriptions of mental states. So suppose take the ascription, I am in pain. Now, if we want such a self-ascription of a mental state to be true or false, we would want the first person pronoun to have a referent, to refer to something. Because if the first person pronoun were merely an empty term, it would be extremely hard to show that, like using standard rules of compositional semantics, it would be extremely hard to show that the entire sentence has a truth value. So you might wonder, well, so this is what like often some philosophers say, well, maybe first personal ascriptions of mental states don't have any truth value. They're neither true nor false. What's the problem? The problem is this. So from first personal ascriptions of mental states, we often derive other sentences, other ascriptions of mental states by means of inference. So think about the following inference. I am in pain. Second premise, I am Nilanjan, therefore Nilanjan is in pain, right? Now this inference is valid. The question is, now a valid inference typically is understood as a truth-preserving inference. It's an inference where necessarily, if the premises are true, the conclusion could not be false. But if the first person is the first personal ascription of the mental state, which is the first premise of the inference, could neither be true nor false, then it would be extremely hard to explain how such an inference is valid in the sense of being truth-preserving. That's the challenge. So it does matter philosophically that the first person pronoun should have a referent. But then the challenge for the Buddhist is to explain how, if there is no fundamentally existent self, the first person refers to something. So that's our question. What I shall do in this talk is focus on a very little section of this amazing text, which a text I find amazing, called the Commentary on the Treasury of Abhidharma, Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya. So in this text, the Abhidharma Buddhist Vasubandhu, who lived between 4th and 5th century CE, he tried to reconcile this Buddhist no-self thesis with the claim that I is a referring expression. And what I'll do is I'll reconstruct this view and then pose a problem for Vasubandhu, and then show how from within Vasubandhu's text, a solution emerges for this problem. One caveat that I want to give before I begin, I want to point out that in fact, what I'm not going to do is look at the other writings of Vasubandhu. So Vasubandhu, according to at least Buddhist hagiography, he was not only an Abhidharma Buddhist, but he wrote within the Yogacara tradition. So it's the same person, according to people. And it turns out that in other Yogacara texts written by Vasubandhu, especially the text called Tringshika, 30 verses, and also his commentary or Madhyanta Vibhaga Bhashya, commentary on Madhyanta Vibhaga Karika, which is like separating the middle and the extremes. So that in that text too, he has views about the self, which I'm not going to talk about. Those views I'm going to set aside for the purposes of this presentation. So let's crack on. So we know just from the history of philosophy that the Buddhists without exception defended the no-self thesis. So the view is that there is no fundamentally existent self. So what is not clear in this is what fundamentally existent really means. So as we know, Buddhists distinguished two levels of reality, two tiers of existence. Often this is misleadingly called in English the doctrine of two truths. I think that's a mistranslation. It is actually the doctrine of two realities. That's what we are talking about. We are talking about ontological status. We are not talking about semantic status of sentences, though they might be related in some way. So Vasubandhu distinguishes two notions of existence, satta, which are fundamental and conventional. So what's the distinction according to Vasubandhu? A fundamentally or substantially existent object is something that is both mereologically and conceptually dependent of other objects. So this might seem a bit abstract and complicated, but we can unpack this. So to be mereologically independent of other objects, an object just has to be impartite, without any parts. So something that is mereologically dependent on other things, it's just so dependent because it is made out of those other objects. So if something has no parts, then it is mereologically independent of other objects. Second, it has to be conceptually independent of other objects. So it cannot be mentally or conceptually analyzed into those other objects. So Vasubandhu actually gives us examples of this. So he points out that, well, take a pot. A pot, if you can physically divide it into parts. The shards of the pot would be the parts that the pot are made out of. So in that sense, a pot is not fundamentally existent because it is mereologically dependent on its parts. Similarly, he says, take water. We can conceptually, even though we might not be physically able to divide water, we might still be able to conceptually analyze water into various other qualities, like its visible form, its fluidity, etc. So given that we can conceptually analyze water into these other qualities, water too cannot be regarded as fundamentally existent. However, Vasubandhu, that's the crucial bit, Vasubandhu thinks that these things can be regarded as conventionally or conceptually existent. So basically, a conventionally or conceptually existent object is a fundamentally non-existent object whose existence is practically useful for us to accept. Now, obviously, what practically useful means will vary according to context. And so the notion of conventional existence or conceptual existence is a context-sensitive notion. It's not a fixed notion. Though Vasubandhu often seems to suggest that the reason why it's practically useful for us to accept the existence of conventionally or conceptually existent objects is precisely because those objects are somehow made out of more fundamentally existent objects. That's the really important issue, as we will see as time passes in this talk. Okay, so that's the distinction. So this distinction should be familiar to you all just by reading Indian philosophy, because like many Indian philosophers have taken on this distinction, adapted this distinction in various ways. Now, corresponding to this, there could be two notions of truth, which I'm not committed to the idea that this is actually there in the texts, but one way of understanding, if you translate satya, the Sanskrit word satya, as true rather than real, then you might think that, and this is sometimes the way the Buddhists themselves talk, you might think, well, a content of a state of awareness, jnana, experience or thought, is fundamentally true just in case it accurately reflects how things are at the level of fundamental existence. So it captures how things really are. By contrast, a content of a state of awareness is conventionally true if and only if it presupposes or entails the existence of fundamentally non-existent objects, but still is practically useful for us to accept because it indirectly reflects or tracks how things are at the level of fundamental existence. And it's important for Vasubandhu because, in fact, Vasubandhu points out that the fundamental truth or fundamental reality, it's basically not an object of any ordinary awareness. So it is only an object of a certain kind of direct, non-conceptual awareness that gives you access to how the world fundamentally is. And it also is the object of a kind of ordinary awareness that follows after that non-conceptual awareness. So it's a case where you have gained non-conceptual awareness to the structure of reality, and then when you come back to the world, you undergo a number of ordinary awareness events, and there the earlier conceptual awareness sort of keeps permeating your non-conceptual, your ordinary awareness. So that's how. So the idea basically is that normally our ordinary awareness events, our ordinary states of awareness, don't give us access to the structure of fundamental reality. Okay. So Vasubandhu's strategy basically is to argue for the following view. It's called Abhidharma Reductionism. So the view is that the expression self refers to a causally connected stream of momentary psychophysical elements called the aggregates, skandha, which are parts of the body as well as the mental and physical events that accompany it. So notice this is the view that Vasubandhu will be defending. The important thing about this view is that it reduces, or it says that the referent of the word self is a causally connected stream of momentary psychophysical elements. Now, since a stream of such psychophysical elements is mereologically reducible to its constituents, to its parts, it depends on its parts for its existence. So it cannot be fundamentally existent in the sense that Vasubandhu has defined. So the self cannot fundamentally exist. But according to Vasubandhu, it can still be regarded as conventionally existent. Okay, so that's the view that Vasubandhu has. All right, so So what's the argument for the view that Vasubandhu, for reductionism that Vasubandhu gives? So in the text, Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya, Vasubandhu, so the main discussion of the self occurs in the 9th chapter, the 9th Kosha Sthana. But actually, something that people don't read very carefully is that there are lots of other places in the text where he does discuss the notion of the self. So here's one such place where he actually distinguishes two distinct conceptions of the self. So he says, well, now here, the outsiders, that is the non-Buddhists, having accepted the theory of the self, come forward. So these people will be claiming that, well, given that there is transmigration, there is rebirth, there has to exist a self. So the claim is, if it is asserted that a sentient being, that is a being like us, passes to another world, that is to an afterlife, then a self is established. This very claim is refuted. Now, the verse says the self does not exist. But then Vasubandhu asks, what sort of self does not exist? The response, that which is imagined to make a connection with other aggregates, having thrown away these aggregates. So the idea is that it's the kind of self which sort of takes up a new body or and the mental states that go with it in another birth, having thrown away the earlier body and the mental states that go with it in this previous birth. Something continues, but most of it goes. So such an inner agent of action, that's what he says, doesn't exist. So the idea is that we are rejecting a self that sort of appropriates aggregates in a new birth, having thrown away the aggregates in a previous birth. And this has been said by the Blessed One, Buddha. There is action and there is maturation of the fruits of action, but no agent is apprehended who throws away these aggregates and makes a connection with other aggregates elsewhere in another birth. For there is a formula pertaining to the factors, to the ultimately existent objects. With respect to that, there is this formula pertaining to the factors, namely, when this is present, that arises, which is just an expanded statement of dependent arising, the view that everything is causally conditioned. If this is so, what sort of self is not refuted? So this is the second conception of the self. Just the mere aggregates alone. If the mere aggregates are figuratively described as the self, then that is not refuted. So from this, we see two different conceptions of the self emerging. According to the first conception, the self is an inner agent of activity which exists separately from the aggregates and acquires new aggregates when it is reborn and throws away the old aggregates when it dies. So the idea, so this is the kind of self that is not palatable to the Buddhist, the Vasubandhuvian sort. Under the second conception, there is no such agent of inner activity. The term self is just figuratively or non-literally applied to the aggregates themselves. Now, it is really crucial that the word is figuratively used and not literally used. It's because the momentary, according to Vasubandhu, as he keeps pointing out, the momentary aggregates cannot literally transmigrate. They cannot sort of move from one birth to another because they don't persist through time. However, we can figuratively say that a stream of aggregates conditioned by afflictions and so on, they can enter a womb, etc., just as we can figuratively say that a lamp moves to a different place. So in either case, there is no lamp. That's just a conventionally existent object that we have constructed conceptually. Similarly, there is no stream of aggregates. That's only a conventionally existent object that we have constructed conceptually. Okay. So why is the first conception of the self rejected? So as Vasubandhu later goes on to argue, the first conception of the self is much more harmful than the second one. So he says, well, so this is at the beginning of the 9th chapter. He says, is it certainly the case that there is no liberation anywhere other than this Buddhist path? There isn't. Response. So what's the reason? Because those non-Buddhists are entrenched in a misleading view about the self. For they don't determine that the concept of the self applies to a stream of aggregates alone. Rather, they imagine the self to be a completely distinct substance, and all afflictions arise from an attachment to the self. So the idea is that, well, it's bad because the view, first of all, is false. It's a misleading view. And because the view is also practically harmful, because all the different kinds of afflictions that give rise to suffering, they arise from an attachment to that sort of a self that the non-Buddhists imagine to exist. So Vasubandhu explains what this misleading view about the self is. He says, the self view ascribes unreal selfhood to real objects, the aggregates, such as material form, and so on. Material form is just the body, treating them as an agent, as a subject, and as being under one's control. And an attachment to extreme views, for example, the non-Buddhist view that the self is eternal, or the sort of Lokayata view that the self is destroyed at death, and the rest arise on the basis of that self view. So they are said to be lacking any corresponding real object. So that's why, so Vasubandhu thinks basically that the first conception of self, it's not just harmful, it's just false. And that is why we should reject it. That is why we should jettison it and replace it with a more innocuous conception of the self. Okay. So Vasubandhu's argument for reductionism basically amounts to this. So if you look at the margin note at the bottom of the 3rd page, there the idea is that, so there's a small exchange. It says, the opponent says, still, how is it known that the expression self refers to a stream of aggregates alone, but not to any other referent? The reply is, because there is an absence of perception and inference.
Dr. Nilanjan, are you sharing something? Because we can't see anything on the screen.
So I shared a handout, right?
In fact, you need to click on present now.
No,
and then,
so I shared a handout which you were supposed to download. Did people not download the handout?
You shared it in the chat box, right?
It was shared in the chat box. It was shared. Yes.
Okay.
We downloaded.
Yeah, you have to
I did not
download
do
the
that.
handout. So
Okay,
I said that I will be reading from the
Got
handout.
it. Thank you.
No, it is.
Yeah, it is in the chat box. So if you click on the link, it will open in PDF.
Yes. So Vasubandhu's argument for reductionism is just this. The expression self refers to something. That's the first premise. The second premise is, if the expression self refers to anything, then its referent can be established either by means of perception or inference. That's the second premise. Neither perception nor inference can establish that there is a constituent of a person which exists separately from the aggregates and plays the roles assigned to the referent of self. So that's the neither perception nor inference idea. And finally, that's the most crucial premise, which is that the roles assigned to the referent of self can be played by a stream of aggregates. So the expression self refers to a stream of aggregates. So what is unclear? So there are lots of places where you could reject this argument. One way of rejecting the argument would be to reject the third premise of the argument, as many other Brahminical philosophers do. They either claim that perception gives us access to the self, as the Mimamsakas say, or they could say, like the Nayayikas do, that inference gives us access to the self. But the crucial premise, let's just grant that premise is correct. But the crucial premise here really is the fourth premise, because without it, the argument does not go through. The fourth premise says that the roles assigned to the referent of self can be played by a stream of aggregates. So that is something that needs to be argued for. So at least notice that at least one of the roles that the referent of self is supposed to play is that it's supposed to be the referent of the first person pronoun, I. So unless we can show, so what we need basically is a positive argument for the claim that the first person pronoun refers to a stream of aggregates. So that's where the semantics of the first person pronoun becomes relevant. That's why we need to explore what Vasubandhu says about the first person pronoun. Okay. So Vasubandhu considers a view about the first person pronoun in response to an objection, which argues that that unless there is a real self, unless there is a substantial self, practical motivation itself would be impossible. So this is actually an argument that is discussed in a lot of detail by later Mimamsakas, such as Kumarila. So the view is this: if the self doesn't exist, for the sake of what does one undertake action? So that's the question. The response: for the sake of a purpose, like I would be happy and I wouldn't suffer, I wouldn't be in pain. The question then is, what is this thing called I, which is the intentional object, the Vishaya of the I awareness? And the response: that awareness has the aggregates as its intentional object. It's the Vishaya, that awareness has as its Vishaya the aggregates themselves. Now, one tricky issue about translation here is that people often translate ahankara in various different ways. The reason why I translate it as I awareness is just because it conforms to the way Vasubandhu's commentators take it, where like Yashomitra basically takes it as just a state of awareness that takes the form such as I. Okay. So now Vasubandhu goes on to give two different arguments for this claim that he has just made, that I awareness has the aggregates as its intentional object. He says, so the opponent asks, how is this known? The response is, first, because there is love for them, and because there is co-referentiality of the I awareness with awareness events that take the form fair and so on. In awareness events that take the form I am fair, I am dark, I am fat, I am thin, I am old, and I am young, this I awareness is observed to be co-referential with awareness events that take the form fair and the like. And these are not features of the self, at least not the features of the self of the sort that the Brahminical philosophers accept. On that basis, too, it is known that this I awareness arises with respect to the aggregate. So as far as I can see, there are two arguments here which we can reconstruct as follows. So the first one is the argument from self-love. So the view is the referent of I serves as the target of a peculiar kind of affection or concern, what Vasubandhu and other Buddhist thinkers call self-love. So for example, when I think about like the way people act very often, I am currently saving money so that I would be looked after in my old age, I would be comfortable in my old age. So there, you might argue that the object of my concern is not a distinct substance which is sort of separate from the body and other mental states, but rather it is something more sort of corporeal. So it's basically, I'm concerned about my physical health, I'm concerned about my mental health, and that's what I'm really trying to sort of look after. So it's my future body or my future sort of stream of mental events that I'm trying to sort of preserve or help there by saving up money now. So these sorts of sort of ordinary patterns of future directed self-concern suggest that the referent of I there, or the referent of I there, are just the aggregates, are either it's just the physical body or the stream of mental events that goes with it. So from that, we can say the aggregates are the target of such affection or concern, so the aggregates are the referent of I. So that's one argument. The second argument is more interesting because it actually is discussed quite often in later literature. So the view is that our ordinary self-ascriptions, such as I am fair, I am dark, and so on, can be correctly ascribe physical characteristics to the referent of I. So in some sense, these ascriptions are all correct. But note that fairness or darkness, etc., these are not characteristics of some non-corporeal distinct substance called the self. They're just characteristics of the body. So they can only be correct if physical aggregates can be the referent of I. So the physical aggregates can be the referent of I. So these are the two arguments that Vasubandhu gives us. Now, it seems to me that, the first objection, somehow I have deleted it, but it doesn't matter. I'll just tell you what the objection is. So on Vasubandhu's, so a Buddhist thinker, a Brahminical thinker can resist these arguments. So they can resist the argument from self-love by saying that, well, it is true that the aggregates are the target of the kind of future-directed self-concern that we feel for ourselves. But that's a result of a delusion. We are just massively deluded about what the self really is, or we are at least confused about what the self really is, which is why we feel this sort of self-concern for the aggregates. So that's the first response to the first argument. The second response, which is actually what Vasubandhu considers in the text, it says that, in fact, self-ascriptions like I am fair, etc., they don't correctly ascribe physical characteristics to the referent of I. So it's just denying the first premise of the second argument. So these ascriptions like I am fair or I am thin and so on, these are only non-literally or figuratively true. Now, this view is again super common in later writers. They point out two kinds of things. So one thing that they point out is that there are defeaters for judgments of this kind. So my statement that I am fair, just as I can say I am fair, I can also say my body is fair, where I'm sort of putting a kind of a gap between myself and my body, treating myself as the possessor of the body. So if we take the second kind of judgment seriously, then that seems to refute or defeat the first judgment. So that suggests that the first judgment may not exactly be right. The other thing to point out, which is again something that Vasubandhu himself notes, is that we often use the word I in a non-literal way. For example, if I am in a restaurant and I've ordered, say, a sandwich, suppose I see the waiter coming and I raise my hand and I say, I am the sandwich, just to sort of say that that sandwich belongs to me. So that's a case where I'm using the word I non-literally. Similarly, when my car is, say, parked behind the building, I can say, well, I am parked behind the building. That's another case where I am literally not parked behind the building, my car is. So these ways of using the word I can sort of help us explain away these self-ascriptions of physical characteristics. The third objection, which I think is philosophically most interesting, it says that anyone who allows the body to be the referent of the word I, they face a challenge. They need to explain why a certain body, say when I am using the word I, why this body, but not any other, is picked out by I. So why do I pick out my body, but not the body of someone else using the word I? So this is again an objection that Vasubandhu considers. So what this shows is that even though Vasubandhu has given us two arguments for treating the aggregates as the referent of I, the arguments don't seem decisive. All right. So what's the solution? On behalf of Vasubandhu, I want to suggest that he has the resources to respond to these worries. And the resources come from a causal theory of reference that Vasubandhu defends elsewhere while arguing against a certain Buddhist view about persons called Pudgalavada. So these Pudgalavadins, they are basically emergentists about persons. So they don't think persons can be reduced to collections of aggregates. Rather, a person is an entity which is real in some sense because it emerges out of the aggregates. So they depend on the aggregates but cannot be reduced to them. So against the Pudgalavadins, Vasubandhu points out that, well, this is implausible simply because the way we apply the concept of person is always on the basis of our awareness of the aggregates themselves. So I see a body moving around, or I'm aware of my own mental states. On the basis of that, I conceptualize the relevant entity as a person or conceptualize myself as a person. So given that it's the aggregates which are triggering the application of the concept of a person, it must be that the concept of a person is tracking the aggregates themselves. So the theory basically boils down to this. A concept, pragyapti, refers to an object of kind K if, in competent users of the concept, applications of the concept are typically or normally caused by an initial awareness of objects of that kind. So that's the view. Now we can apply this. So in the person case, the concept of a person refers to aggregates because in competent users of the concept, the applications of the concept of a person, they are caused typically by the initial awareness of the aggregates themselves. So if we apply this idea to the I concept, we get the following result, like same result, basically. The I concept is applied in our first personal thoughts, either on the basis of our sensory awareness of our body. When one thinks I'm fair, I look at myself in the mirror, I look at my hands, and I think I'm fair, misleadingly. Or on the basis of our attention to our inner states. For example, when one thinks I am in pain, one is attending to the pain. In either case, the application of the I concept is based, or typically based, on certain states of awareness which are directed at aggregates belonging to a particular stream. Conclusion, the I concept should refer to those aggregates. So that's the view. Now, I think this solution on behalf of Vasubandhu actually helps us make sense of things that Vasubandhu says. So first of all, it accounts for Vasubandhu's response to the third worry that we discussed in the last section. So the third worry was that, well, if I refers to the body, why does it refer to a certain body and not any other? Why does it refer to my body but not any other? So Vasubandhu responds to this worry by saying that, well, an I awareness can only refer to the stream of aggregates on which it causally depends in the right way. So I cannot refer to a body that doesn't overlap with the stream of physical aggregates on which the I awareness depends. So the idea is that there has to be a certain kind of causal dependence which sort of determines the referent of I. I cannot just refer to any arbitrary body. It has to refer to the physical aggregates which trigger the application of the concept I in the case of a certain person. Second, it explains certain other parts of the Bhashya where Vasubandhu, in the context of, for example, distinguishing how we understand the notion of internal and external, or in the context of like just our sort of experience of the world, he points out that the reason why we take the mental events or to be internal, or like things pertaining to the mind to be internal, it is because often we use the word I on the basis of our awareness of various mental events. So the idea is that, like, because the concept of I is often, in certain contexts at least, is sort of applied on the basis of an initial introspective awareness of mental states, that explains why I often refers to just a stream of mental events and not the physical aggregates at all. So the final theory that emerges from all this is that the first person pronoun involves two kinds of context sensitivity. First of all, what a certain use of I refers to depends on which aggregates serve as the proximate causes of the relevant use of the pronoun. And depending on the context, I may pick out mental aggregates or physical aggregates or both kinds of aggregates. So the semantics of I that we end up with is just this. In any context, the application of the concept I in a thought or any utterance of the expression I refers to a contextually salient collection of mental and physical aggregates which serve in the right way as the proximate causes of the relevant awareness or utterance. So that's the view. I'll skip the next section on ownership of mental states and go straight to the conclusion. So Vasubandhu so far has claimed that the no-self thesis can be reconciled with the view that I is a referring expression. A consequence of this view is that our self-ascriptions of mental and non-mental states can be truth-apt. So just to explain why this is the case, so consider self-ascriptions of mental states like I am pleased or I am in pain. The Nyaya philosophers, who are very often Vasubandhu's opponent, they assume that one and two, ascribe mental states of pleasure and pain to a basis, an ashraya, in which those mental states reside, and that ashraya, that basis, is a distinct substance called the self. By contrast, Vasubandhu thinks that these self-ascriptions are more like ascriptions of the form, the forest has borne fruit. To see how the analogy works, think about number 3. In 3, the expression the forest refers to a collection of trees, while the ascription of the predicate has borne fruit conveys that some fruit has arisen having as its basis one or more of the trees in that collection, where basis just means cause. The same, according to Vasubandhu, is true of 1 and 2. I refers to a stream of physical and mental aggregates, while the ascription of the predicates am pleased or am in pain conveys that a state of pleasure or pain has arisen, having as its basis one or more of the aggregates within that stream. Importantly, none of these ascriptions can be fundamentally true or false because they presuppose the existence of streams of aggregates or collections of things, which are fundamentally non-existent because they are dependent on paths. But they can be conventionally true because they are practically useful for us to accept insofar as they implicitly track causal relations amongst the aggregates. I will stop there and let's hear what you have to say in response. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nilanjan. Really, it was a nice survey of Vasubandhu's last chapter. That is, I think, 9th chapter in his Abhidharma Reductionism. So the expression I, can you, Ajit sir, can you just turn off your mind for a minute, then you can ask your questions.
जी सर, ओके सर, बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद सर नीलांजन जी को।
अभी आप अपना क्वेश्चन पूछ लीजिएगा
सर।
If you have questions, you can ask your questions. We have this chat box also open, so you can type your questions in the chat box. So,
Professor Nilanjan?
yes, please, Shruti Bhatt. Yes, that is also a way you can raise your hand, and then as per the sequence, I will allow you. So, Shruti Bhatt.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I just have a query. So, what would has Vasubandhu discussed upon something like when you use the word "I" to refer to your deep sleep experience, which is a very Advaitins take it very seriously. So, sukhena swapsam na kinchidavedisham. So has Vasubandhu talked about this? Because there he cannot say that the I refers to either an aggregate of mental states because there are no mental states there. Neither he can say that it's about aggregate of body because there is no body.
That's interesting. First of all, even if I'm not wrong about the Advaitin view, which I might be, according to the Advaitin, it's not that there is no awareness at all. There is the sakshan, which is always there, even in the state of deep sleep, right? So if that is correct, then let's just there is no sakshan on the Abhidharma view. But let's just assume that there is some state of awareness, some sort of liminal state of awareness, which remains, which persists even when you're sleeping. Then there are these mental aggregates, Vasubandhu would say, which remain active even in that state. In fact, if you look at the two views very carefully, there are certain analogies between the two views. So, for example, in Vasubandhu's, so the theory of alaya vijnana, so storehouse awareness that Vasubandhu defends in Yogacara texts, which seems like very similar to this notion of a kind of a sort of a unconscious state of awareness where like the state of awareness persists, it is registering things that are going on, but it's just not, it's a kind of a subpersonal unconscious awareness which still continues throughout your, like whenever, even when you're asleep. So that's one thing to say. The other thing to say is that, well, Vasubandhu could also take a completely deflationary view about this whole like ascriptions of the said, well, I was sleeping well, or I'm sleeping comfortably or happily, or however you take it. So he could say, well, in fact, you are not really aware of sleeping happily or comfortably when you were asleep. Really, the way you know this is that you wake up refreshed. So you just infer that, well, you had a good sleep. That's all. So there, the I just refers to the physical aggregates, the body, and nothing else. So that would be the second response.
Yeah, I don't know, but anyway, in Advaita Siddhi, there is a huge discussion that how this cannot be an inference. And they show that how it actually goes to a lot of, it faces a lot of hetva bhasas. And yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm not convinced, but yeah, but that's my view.
Yeah, thank you.
So that's a nice question, in fact, to reflect on, because if we always look for some kind of underlying substance of the awareness states, then certainly the Sakshin viewpoint would be interesting. But if we simply consider a kind of changing, fleeting states of awareness, then what Dr. Nilanjan said in the last, that is the response, in fact, on the part of Vasubandhu, that yes, when we are reporting that we had a nice sleep, so we are reporting a present mental state. And of course, the samskara theory is, I think, available for them to explain inferentially what could have been the previous mental states, which are not reported immediately during sleep. So it's a good question, and response is also well taken. So, do we have some more questions? You please raise your hand and. Any question from Ajit Kumar Thakur ji? You wanted to ask something?
जी सर, मैं ये थैंक यू सर, नीलांजन जी ने बहुत ही सारगर्भित अपना लेक्चर दिए, इसके लिए पूरी मेरी ओर से पूरी धन्यवाद। मेरा कोई क्वेश्चन नहीं है, बस यही कहना चाहूंगा। जी
हाँ,
सर।
अब हिंदी में भी बात हो सकती है। डॉक्टर नीलंजन हिंदी जानते हैं अच्छे से।
कोई बात नहीं सर, वो भी मेरा मित्र ही है।
जी जी धन्यवाद। Any other question if we have from any other participant? Dr. Nirmalya? There is something in the chat box, so can you read it?
Yes, I'm looking.
What is the semanticist of Atma Sneha or Sakshi Bhava?
I'm not fully grasping what the question is. So
What
the
is the
response to
semantics
the
of-
Atma, just to finish, the response to the Atma Sneha, the affect self-love argument was just that. So Vasubandhu would just claim that when you in the kinds of attitudes that drive self-love, the kinds of thoughts that drive self-love or arise out of self-love, that the first person pronoun will just be referring to either the physical aggregates or the mental aggregates or to both together. So the semantics remains the same everywhere. I'm not sure about the Sakshi Bhava because there's obviously we are just taking ideas from Advaita and just like trying to put them in this much earlier Abhidharma context. So Vasubandhu has no treatment of Sakshi Chaitanya. So there is no answer to that question. But he would say that across the board, the word I know what Sakshi Chaitanya is, but what I'm saying is that there is no discussion of in the Abhidharma context of Sakshi Chaitanya. Second, the answer across the board would be that the word I refers to mental and physical aggregates. So the answer would be the same everywhere.
Yeah. Any more question from any? So just one curiosity from my side, if you allow, please.
Mm-hmm.
If I see the discussion in the Abhidharma Bhashya, there Vasubandhu is basically responding to a particular viewpoint within the Buddhist tradition regarding this reference of I. I think it is Vatshiputriyas, what you call Puddugalavadins. So
no, that's not entirely correct. So the way the text goes, take just the 9th section. So the text starts out with an argument against the self, right? Then it moves to the discussion of the Vatsiputriyas, the personalists, the Pudgalavadins. That discussion finishes, then Vasubandhu goes back to what he calls the Tirthikas, who are the non-Buddhists. And this discussion of the referent of I that I translated in the handout, that occurs like in the immediately after the discussion of the Nyaya Vaisheshika view. So it's not immediately clear whose view it is, but it could be a Nyaya Vaisheshika view. So his commentators don't really tell us. Neither, like as far as I can tell, none of the commentators tell us whose view exactly that is. But the interesting thing is that you do see sort of versions of that view in both later Nyaya writers like Udyotakara, as well as Kumarila, who has read Udyotakara. So.
Madhu?
Yes, actually, I have just one. I think it may be a very general comment or curiosity from my side. Is that is it fair to say that the beginning or the basic assumption here from the Buddhist side is that everything is ultimately made up of parts, and what we see as or what we call names that we give is the collection of the parts, and mistakenly some of the time we believe that it is referring to some what you call this meteorological fallacy or something like that, that we are referring to the something permanent or something over and above the parts, some entity which is over and above the parts, which has ontological status over and above the parts which constitute it. By that means that the nothing in this world which is the most simple substance, like the Leibniz monads, would qualify to be having any ontological status which can be referred to directly, fixed, which has to which we can directly refer to, like, this is, I mean, in general, I mean, I know because I'm both sides. I'm not very good at Indian either, So but in general, this is my feeling type question. Ultimately, that there's nothing in this world which will, qualify, which goes in favor of them. I mean, that's right.
Yeah. So I think you are making a very good observation there. I think the view, you're right. So Vasubandhu's views about language are kind of interesting. So he seems to think that language always has, to some extent, it is always misleading in some way. So that is actually a sort of a more pervasive Buddhist view. Where the idea is that, yes, most of the ways in which we keep talking about things, like at least our ordinary uses of language, they're always misleading because they are not sort of carving the way the world is at its joints. And the reason why they are not doing it is that all our concepts generally, they are talking about macro objects in some way, like big objects. So big objects in the sense that they are either they have parts in the way chairs and tables do, or they can be conceptually analyzed into other things. So normally we are just talking about precisely those objects. So in that sense, ordinary language is misleading because it doesn't reflect how the world really is. However, there is still, you might wonder, what he himself is doing when he's doing philosophy, right? So because he is trying to give you the correct picture of the way the world is in one way or another. The whole project of the Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya and the Abhidharma Kosha itself is to sort of give you lists of things that exist, and then to decide which of those things can be treated as ultimately existent, which of them cannot be treated as ultimately existent. So the question then would be, what do we say about philosophical uses of language, not ordinary ones? Vasubandhu would say that even there is some distortion going on. But the important thing about the kind of ontological scheme that the Abhidharma philosophers are giving you is that they are better than the ontological schemes that we ordinarily work with, because the Abhidharma ontological schemes are less misleading. They can be used as a map for reality, not a perfect. So maps are kind of inaccurate, but they sort of can help you guide, like get to the places you want to get to. In that sense, even though they involve some distortion, they can still be useful, pragmatically useful, for getting to the sort of non-conceptual awareness or the non-conceptual access to reality that you ultimately want as a Buddhist. So I think you have raised a really interesting question there, which gets to the heart of the project.
I think I have now just that was I have a better formulation for what I was trying to say in with reference to your talk and the terminology that you've used. So conventional reality and the Ladin language that we use to refer to convention is basically describing conventional reality, and it can never describe ultimate reality. And ultimate reality, we
that is
whatever
correct.
we assume to be wherever we trying to get so ontological, beings or what ontological status we try to assume to referring to with vis-a-vis the conventional reality. Basically, it is all sangya khyati, it is all mistaken view, and ultimate reality is what it is, that aggregate view thing kind of thing.
But the important thing to point out is that the notion of conventionally real, that's a context-sensitive one. So in ordinary contexts, talk of selves and persons and things like that can be useful, right? They can still count as conventionally existent. But suppose we are in a context where we are considering like what ultimately exists or what sort of ontological picture we need to have to liberate ourselves from the bad practical attitudes that we have. In that context, talking about selves or persons may not anymore be practically useful. In fact, switching to the Buddhist talk of aggregates might be more useful. So in that context, those things would be that sort of talk of conventional existence would be better. But the idea is ultimately that none of these really will give us, none of these statements can really give us access to the way the world actually is.
Your mic is off,
this,
Madhu.
no, I just turned it on. Actually, meanwhile, I was trying to remember the logician, mathematician, his name, who has the written the on non-being and something. जिनको हम मिले थे सर वहां पे अभी यहाँ पे नालंदा में जब वो बात इस पे जब बात कर रहे थे.
So are you talking about Graham Priest?
Graham Priest.
Graham Priest. Yeah, Graham Priest. Yeah. So there again, I think he was in context of the Nagarjuna's discussion about ultimate and the Samritti and Parmarth. Ultimately, Buddhists also, or the Nagarjuna's view was also, and he was trying to show it mathematically, that ultimately it is, there is, from one point of view, it is the, there is no much difference. I mean, it's relative, the absolute and relative is all again something like interdependent somehow. From one perspective, what is relative, from other perspective, it could be absolute. I mean, like Samritti Parmartha, I remember one statement that from one point of view, what is Samritti is Parmartha, what is Parmartha is Samritti. That is also a conclusion derived from Nagarjuna, if I am correct. And
yes,
but added to this is, yeah, please.
I want to sort of, I think we need to be very careful here because, first of all, set aside what Graham Priest thinks. The important thing here to notice is that not all Buddhists subscribe to the same version of this theory of two tiers of existence. So the Madhyamikas, who are basically Mahayana Buddhists, they have a much stronger view, or a very different view about what the distinction between the two tiers of existence actually amounts to. So the Madhyamikas, the disagreement between someone like Vasubandhu here, an Abhidharma Buddhist, and a Madhyamika like Nagarjuna would precisely be concerned with what fundamental existence, or which things are fundamentally existent, or whether there are any things that are fundamentally existent. So Nagarjuna denies that there is anything that is fundamentally existent. So if you have two categories, fundamental existence and conventional existence, Nagarjuna would say that, well, there is nothing in one category. Everything is conventional, right? Vasubandhu doesn't think that. Vasubandhu is a realist. He thinks there are things that are fundamentally existent. But What they would agree with is the limits of language, ordinary language, when it comes to describing the way the world fundamentally is. So both would agree that there is no perfectly correct ways of describing the world as it is. But the disagreement would be, Nagarjuna would say, well, we can still sort of rank different ontological schemes insofar some of them, in the sense that some of them are practically more useful than others. So that is why we can sometimes make like the conventional fundamental distinction in an intelligible way. But in fact, none of them are really tracking the way the world fundamentally is, because there can be no correct description of the way the world fundamentally is. By contrast, Vasubandhu would say that in fact, ontological schemes can be more correct or less correct. So the Buddhist ontological scheme at least comes very close to describing the world as it is fundamentally. But still, there is some distortion. So I think the difference between these views is that, like, it's not that everything is context sensitive. Rather, the point is that some of these people are realists in the sense that they think there's a certain way the world fundamentally is. Others don't think that. So we should be very careful when we are discussing these Buddhists, because they don't all have the same view.
Yeah, thank you very much for clarification.
Can I ask something, Devarji? Hello, can you hear?
Please, everybody ask, please.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nilanjan, for a wonderful presentation. So,
Thanks.
with regard to this,
Yes, Hari.
yeah, okay,
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So, with regard to this notion of conventional existence, I understand that a thing like, say, chair or a tree is understood to be conventionally existent because it's not fundamentally real. At the same time, there is a difference between, say, a tree or a rock on the one hand, and, say, an institution or a nation on the other hand. They are also conventionally existent, but they are not perceivable, whereas tree and chair are perceivable. So the self is conventionally real in which sense? Is it more like a chair or like a nation or an institution?
That's a great question. Thank you. So it depends. So after we have sort of excised, let's say, the kind of self that the Brahminical philosophers talk about, because it's neither sort of perceivable nor established by inference, Vasubandhu would say that we should replace that notion of the self with a better notion of the self, on which the self only is a stream of aggregates. It's a collection of aggregates. Now, the collection of aggregates is something that we can perceive very often. And it's also something that we can know about on the basis of inference, because the aggregates do have causal connections with each other, and they causally influence other things. So in that sense, like, given that the sort of constituents of so basically the idea would be, well, we can perceive, there's a sense at least in which we can perceive the stream of aggregates, or the collection of aggregates. And in that sense, the self indeed is perceivable, or something that we can know on the basis of inference. So it would be more like the rock or the chair or the table. That's what the self would be like. It won't be like a more abstract entity, like a nation or a universal, for instance.
Okay, thank you.
Does that help?
One more question? May I ask one more?
Yeah.
So is Vasubandhu's view consistent with the position taken by some people that ultimately the self is a cultural construction? For example, the notion of self as an agent or an owner did not exist in many cultures. So can it be consistent with this?
I think it can be consistent, right? So suppose we have we can imagine, certainly, maybe there are no such cultures, but we can imagine certainly that there is a culture which has no concept of a forest. It has only a concept of trees, but not a concept of forest, right? So in that case, people won't be picking out things or talking about forests. They won't be taking collections of trees as forests. They won't be judging that there are forests, or they won't be telling each other not to go into the forest. So the same will be true, like, at least Vasubandhu might claim that, well, it's like depends on what's useful. So if it turns out that in a certain cultural context, it was never useful to talk about the self, then it may indeed be the case that the self was never talked about, because concepts only sort of are used insofar as they earn their keep by being being practically useful. So I think that's what he would claim. But I think there is a more sort of a deeper question here, which uh, which makes me sort of suspicious of the hypothesis that there are cultures without any concept whatsoever of a self. And part of the reason I think I'm suspicious of this is that note that on this picture, it's not a heavy weight, the way I started by talking about the three characteristics of a self. It's an extremely thin notion. It just says, well, it's the referent of the first person. It's the thing that has mental states, things that performs actions, and a thing that persists through time. So if that's the view, then it seems to me like almost inconceivable that there are cultures without like a notion that fits that description, because everyone thinks of themselves at least as a subject and an agent of actions. It's kind of difficult for me to imagine a human being who deliberates or performs actions intentionally without thinking of themselves as someone who sort of like is a subject or an agent. So that suggests to me that like even though the self might be a cultural construct, it still has to be a pretty pervasive one. It's hard to imagine a culture without it.
Yeah, thank you. Shruti, you want to ask something more?
Yeah, I thought because there is some time, so I just.
Yeah, we have 5 more minutes.
Yeah, my point is all these arguments are anyway applicable to a self which is not an aggregate, it's one. Maybe only in this janma. I'm not talking about any other future janma or previous janma, nothing like that. But even here in this janma, whatever, that is not the concern. But my concern is why then we have to, why Vasubandhu says that it has to be only an aggregate. What's the problem if it is not an aggregate and it's in one question? And second one is how he would talk about then a thing like I am the one who is happy, and now I am in pain, because here it doesn't seem like you're trying to kind of have a pratyabhijna kind of a thing, but I'm saying that you're telling to one thing, that you're pointing out to something through your language, a consistent thing. So then how he would say, answer all.
Yeah, so let me just answer that very briefly since we are running out of time. So Vasubandhu does talk about recognition very nicely in the 9th chapter of Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya. So he points out that, in fact, it talks about cases of memory where, say, memories which take the form, well, I went to the zoo when I was 5 years old, or memory reports of the form, I remember I went to the zoo when I was 5 years old. There, if you take all the occurrences of I to refer to the same thing, then it would end up being the case that there is something that I refers to which persists through time. As you're saying, it's sort of a unitary thing that sort of exists at different times. So Vasubandhu's response is that, look, we don't have to posit a self, a unitary self, to explain any of these things. So the idea is that, well, like we should only admit into our ontology objects that are not causally redundant, that play some causal role, right? And the claim is that we can explain all these things by just appealing to the momentary physical sort of the sort of impermanent body that we have, and the physical states that it is in, and the mental states that go with it. So the idea would be that we can explain memory simply by appealing to certain kinds of causal connections between different mental states. And so basically there will be an original experience that creates a memory trace, which is then activated, that gives rise to a recollection, that gives rise to a recognition. And what happens there is that we simply, when we are undergoing the recognition of the form, well, this I, or the sort of, this is the same thing that I've seen before, or this is the table that I've touched before, or I'm now seeing the table that I've touched before. All these cases are cases where we are using a sort of, he says, a sangya, a conceptual label. We are just using this, a certain label, to sort of create those judgments, to sort of, so it always involves some sort of, it's in some sort of conceptual construction. So there, according to Vasubandhu, the point is that the self is not needed to do any causal explanatory work in these cases. It's only when you treat these judgments as face value that you end up sort of taking them as the guide to the existence of a self. But Vasubandhu would say they always involve some conceptual construction, so we don't need it. Okay, great. I'm not sure whether that satisfies you, but we are out of time, so I had to stop there.
Yeah, thank you very much,
fact,
Nilan.
Yes, in philosophy, that kind of satisfaction is harmful. So,
Yes, it is good not to be
yeah.
satisfied. Yeah.
Yes, yes. So I think now it is time to call off this session. So I must thank Dr. Nilanjan for being very kind to accept our invitation and be with us for today's session. I express my gratitude to the Indian Council of Philosophical Research, New Delhi, who is sponsoring this meetings. So we expect that, okay, sometime you visit, and then if you're in India, we can have some physical meeting. That would be again a nice session. So thank you very much, Dr. Nilanjan. I must say thanks to all my friends who joined today's session. We have our Guruji, Professor Sabhajit Mishra, who joined just a few minutes before, but I'm glad to see him in the session. Guruji, pranam. Professor Sabhajit Mishra, can you hear me? The mic is off, so I just wanted to have your darshana at least. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Srinivasan. Then we have our student, Simran Raina, and our former colleague, Dr. Harinarayan. Then we have Dr. Gangadharan. Sir, thank you very much for joining this session. And we hope that all our colleagues will be joining in future sessions also. So with these words, I say pranam to all of you. Namaskar. See you sometime later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nilanjan, for a great talk.